In this part of this topic, we're looking at global imbalances. Now, so far we've spoken a lot about the excess savings flowing out of the East and into the West. And this is one definition of global imbalances. So one way of looking at global imbalances is a persistent and large flow of funds from one group of countries to another group of countries. In this case, since the early 2000s, that receiving group of countries was mainly the United States. So one way of looking at global imbalances is excess savings flowing in one direction in large volume for a sustained period of time. Now the problem with that is that that type of flow of money, which is global imbalances, is unsustainable. It does two very dangerous things, dangerous long term anyway. The first thing that it does is it builds up a lot of debt. So America is in the situation at the moment where its government debt levels and household debt levels are incredibly high because of all of this money coming from the East. The Americans have been borrowing this money that has been building up debt. The second thing, and obviously following on from that, there is only so much debt a country can absorb, can take on. So eventually you're going to hit a level, any country is going to hit a level where debt levels are so high they can't take on any more debt, and then once that point is actually hit, it would require a very painful adjustment. So it's better not to get into this sort of situation in the first place. The other thing that it does is it does distort exchange rates. So if we've got a lot of money flowing out of the East into the West, mainly the United States, then as that money moves out of the East, it will flood foreign exchange markets with the currencies of those countries in the East, thereby depressing their exchange rate, or their exchange rates, plural. Now, the impact of that is it has adversely affected, maybe adversely is the wrong word to use, but it has affected the structure of their domestic production, because their exchange rates are so low because of the money flowing out of these countries in the East. They have been focused primarily on export markets. So a lot of their growth has been through exporting, and you've probably heard the term export-led growth. So by having savings high relative to investment, sending that money overseas holds your exchange rate down, and that kind of biases you towards an over-reliance on exports in terms of economic activity, in terms of economic growth. The problem with that is then you are very reliant, perhaps overly reliant, on the economic health of the countries that you're actually exporting to. A preferred model, and a lot of the countries in Asia are realizing this at the moment, is to have domestic consumption be a much more important part of the economy. So rather than relying on export-led growth, where you are subjected to the economic health of the country you're exporting to, if you move away from a reliance on that and rely more on your domestic consumers to drive consumption growth, economic activity, and therefore ultimately GDP growth, you've got a lot more control over the spending habits and spending levels of your domestic citizens than you have the spending levels of your export customers. So a couple of reasons why these global imbalances are A, unsustainable, and B, quite dangerous as well. Now, obviously you need to do a lot of reading about global imbalances, and one of the things you need to focus on is why they are dangerous and why they are sustainable, but I've certainly given you a little bit of a lead into that area. Okay, there are two ways, however, of looking at global imbalances, and when you do your reading you'll have to recognise that there are two ways of looking at global imbalances and be able to explain global imbalances from either perspective. The first perspective I've already been through. Global imbalances involve excess savings moving from one region of the world to another region of the world in large volumes year after year after year. The other way of looking at it is persistent current account deficits in one region of the world and persistent current account surpluses in the other. in another region of the world. Now, if you have done a little bit of reading about the balance of payments, then you'll realise that these two views of global imbalances are basically different sides of the same coin. So if you have Eastern countries sending their excess savings year after year after year in massive volumes to the West, then those countries will be running capital financial account deficits, which will automatically mean they're running current account surpluses. So as soon as you send that money out of the country through the capital financial account, then that money will come back to you under a floating exchange rate regime as a current account surplus. So these two different ways of looking at global imbalances are basically different sides of the same coin. They're just explaining global imbalances from different parts of the balance of payments. Now that explanation that I just gave will make a lot more sense when we hit topic 12, and in fact in topic 12 we'll be coming back to global imbalances once we understand the structure of the balance of payments in more detail, and we'll be going through that type of argument again. But certainly I encourage you to start reading about global imbalances quite widely right now. You certainly don't want to leave it until last week because there's too much to absorb. Okay, so what we've got here is just an illustration of global imbalances, and we've got we're looking at global imbalances from the current account perspective in this diagram, not from the financial flows perspective, from the capital flows perspective, so from the current account. So what we've got here is a situation where the US has been running very large current account deficits because they have a negative savings investment imbalance, and the countries on top in blue, the oil exporters, Germany, Japan, China and Asia, they are running persistent current account surpluses. Now we already know that this is a problem because of the capital flows that this diagram implies. If the United States is running persistent current account deficits, it must mean that it has a negative savings investment imbalance. It must mean that it is bringing money in from overseas. It is absorbing a lot of foreign savings. So when I look at these large columns of current account deficits for the United States, as well as some other countries in there, I look at that and think, the United States is bringing in foreign savings. They're building up a lot of debt to foreigners. That is unsustainable. And because they're bringing in those savings from overseas, that's what's creating the current account deficit. So two ways of looking at global imbalances. You need to understand or define what global imbalances are, what has caused them, and why they are a problem. And also, Ben Bernanke gave a speech a few years ago about why global imbalances are really the major constraint on global economic growth moving forward. So if you can find that paper, that's another, or if you can find that speech, that is another thing worthwhile reading. Okay, and then finally, in terms of macroeconomic factors which have caused or contributed to the global financial crisis, we have loose monetary policy in the United States. So these columns here, these grey columns, are recessions. So in 2008, 2009, in the United States, we've got a recession there associated with the global financial crisis, but the last recession prior to that was in 2001. Now that recession there in 2001, which led to a reduction in the federal funds rate, which is America's version of the cash rate, the federal funds rate was slashed from around about 6.5% down to around about 1% and held there for quite a few years. That recession in 2001 was caused by two factors. First of all, 9/11, and second of all, the dot-com stock market crash in the United States. So because of 9/11 and the dot-com crash, investment and consumption spending really slowed in America, and the Federal Reserve responded by cutting the federal funds rate down to 1%. Now, it's not the fact that the federal funds rate was cut that was a problem. In hindsight, it was cut and held down too long at a level that it was simply too low. So you can see that it was held at around about 1 to 2% from around about 2001 right through to almost 2005. So that is a very long period of very low interest rates. Now, these interest rates, or that interest rate in that diagram, that is the one-day or the overnight interest rate. And we know from previous topics that if the overnight interest rate, the federal funds rate, is low, then the 30, 90, 180-day interest rates are going to be low as well. So all of the short-term interest rates over this period were around about 1.5% in the United States. You subtract off inflation and that gives you a negative real interest rate. So we're talking about very, very low interest rates in the early 2000s. Combine that with the fact that we had a global savings glut in the world, and a lot of excess savings coming out of the East into the US. These were pushing up bond prices and pushing down long-term bond yields or long-term interest rates. So we had very low short-term interest rates in the United States because the Fed was holding those short-term interest rates low. We had very low long-term interest rates because of the global savings glut and the amount of money coming into the United States. So right across the yield curve, interest rates were incredibly low, and they stayed low for a handful of years, for around about 4 or 5 years. Now they were raised in about 2005, 2006, but the damage had been done. All of these low interest rates meant that the banking system was willing to borrow all of this money coming in at these very low interest rates. They were able to loan it out to customers at very low interest rates, and America really just simply got drunk on cheap credit. They got drunk on cheap money. There was too much money. Interest rates across the yield curve were far too low, and that really did fuel excessive borrowing and spending in the United States. Now, not only is excessive borrowing and spending for a sustained period potentially a bit of an issue, but also you've got to consider what they did with the funds that they were borrowing. We know from history now that a lot of that money was going into the housing market, and a lot of it was being spent on consumables, and eventually a lot of that money that was coming in went into the subprime lending market. And that's when things really started to deteriorate, when subprime lending kicked off, because that really did reduce the quality of the mortgage-backed securities that were being created, and eventually led to the global financial crisis being triggered in 2008. Okay, so that's the role of loose monetary policy. Once again, I've given you a little bit of a feel for what the issue is about. You need to go away and do some additional reading in this area. Okay, also the Great Moderation. This is another area that you have to do some reading in. I'll just define it very, very quickly using this diagram. From around about the mid-1980s onwards, right through to almost the present day. It's sort of ongoing, apart from this little blip called the global financial crisis, which caused a bit of a ripple. What we see in this graph is that the standard deviation of real GDP growth really fell starting in the mid-1980s. So if GDP growth is less volatile, and this is for the United States, but it occurred right throughout the developed world. If GDP growth is less volatile, inflation will be less volatile, unemployment will be less volatile, and the economy will be growing much more smoothly. There were fewer recessions over this period as well. You can see in terms of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, this red line dipped below zero quite frequently. They are recessions that you're looking at there, and some of these recessions were quite significant in size. Post-1980, however, there were very few instances of GDP growth of less than zero, and the occasions when GDP growth did fall below zero, it wasn't overly severe in magnitude, apart from the GFC 2008, 2009 there. That looks like minus almost 8% GDP growth, which is obviously a very severe recession. So that's what the Great Moderation is. It's really just a period that we moved into in the 1980s of very strong economic growth, but low volatility in that growth, combined with low volatility in unemployment and inflation. Now, your task, if you choose to take it, is figuring out what the causes of the Great Moderation were. And the information's readily available. You should have no problem coming up with a list of 3 or 4 good reasons or causes of the Great Moderation. But of course you need to acknowledge that the Great Moderation was a contributing factor to the global financial crisis. The reason for that was that the Great Moderation was a period of strong growth, few recessions and low inflation. So people simply got complacent. They became overconfident about the future. And that is really attributed to America's willingness to borrow a lot of this money coming in from the East and spend it. So people were overly confident. And when I'm talking about overly confident, I'm talking everyone from municipal governments, state governments, the federal government, households, companies, right across the board, particularly in the United States. They were, in hindsight, overconfident because of this temporary Great Moderation period that we were in. In fact, a lot of people, when we were in this Great Moderation period, prior to the GFC, a lot of people were saying that the business cycle was actually dead, because growth was so strong, so stable, people thought the business cycle had actually disappeared. Well, the global financial crisis proved them wrong, and the problems that we're having post-GFC in the global economy also proves that the business cycle did not disappear. It disappeared for a little while, or the magnitude of the swings in the business cycle disappeared for a little while, but it certainly it certainly ended once the GFC hit. So that's the Great Moderation. And then, in summary, what are the macroeconomic factors? I've listed them there. You need to, as I've said before, you need to understand global imbalances very, very well. In terms of 10 out of 10, in terms of sort of a scale out of 10, global imbalances gets a 10 out of 10 in terms of how well you need to understand that topic. The Great Moderation, I would give it sort of a 6 out of 10 in terms of importance, and loose monetary policy in the US, I would give it probably around about a 3 to 4 out of 10 in terms of importance. Now, 3 to 4 out of 10 doesn't mean you don't need to know it. It's just a sort of an indicator of how well you have to know that particular topic. You certainly have to know about loose monetary policy in the United States and how it contributed, but certainly not as much as global imbalances and not quite as much as the Great Moderation. So hopefully that gives you a feel for where you need to target your reading in terms of the causes of the global financial crisis. The next recording I'll take you through the financial market factors which led to the GFC.